Hello everyone. Welcome to the session on pattern markings. In this session, we will learn about the terms and symbols marked on a pattern and also understand their meaning and purpose. We will also learn how a basic block is adapted to create a pattern. To start with, let's have a clarity on what a pattern is. A pattern is a paper cutout or a template of the individual parts of a garment. The patterns are placed on the fabric and the fabric is cut according to the shape of these patterns. The cut fabric pieces are stitched together to create a complete garment. Patterns are essentially made so that the same style can be easily duplicated when it is needed and multiple pieces can be easily made. Patterns are made for every individual part of a garment. For example, for a garment such as shirt, which may have different pieces like front, back, sleeve, cuff, collar, pocket, a separate pattern will be created for each of these components. In other words, patterns are the exact replica of the individual parts of a garment which are used for fabric cutting. Before proceeding further, we must have greater clarity on the various stages in the making of a pattern, which are: number 1, creation of a basic block; number 2, development of a working or sample pattern; and third, finalizing the production pattern. Basic blocks are drafted to a specific set of body measurements and includes only the minimum wearing ease. They conform to the actual body shape and are developed without any design features. The basic blocks are basic bodice front, basic bodice back, basic skirt front, basic skirt back, basic sleeve. Sometimes basic trousers blocks are also regarded as one of the basic blocks. Making basic blocks eliminates the need for starting from scratch for developing the patterns. These basic blocks can be adapted again and again to develop working or sample patterns according to the design requirements of the garment. The working or a sample pattern is the next stage in the pattern development process in the garment industry. The working pattern is created using basic blocks as the foundation. A working pattern includes all the design features along with the wearing and design ease. The working pattern is created for each part of the garment. This pattern is used for making sample garment, which is tested through fitting sessions for carrying out the necessary pattern alterations as needed. A working pattern may also be modified through successive fitting trials. The final stage of pattern making is the finalization of the production pattern. As the name suggests, a production pattern is used for manufacturing large number of garments of the same style. This is the finalized version of a sample pattern which has gone through fitting trials and which is complete in all respects, including pattern markings. This pattern is also used for grading. Grading process involves proportionate increase and decrease of the size of the pattern. In simple words, through grading process, patterns of different sizes of the same style are produced. Production patterns are used for actual bulk production of garments. These patterns contain clear instructions and markings that enables an efficient layout on fabric. These markings also ensure proper cutting of fabric pieces and in their assembly while stitching. Let us now make use of an example of developing a pattern of a flared skirt using a basic skirt block to understand how a basic block is adapted to create a pattern and what kind of information and symbols are marked on it. Since the pattern includes all design features, we must first know about the design features that we want to incorporate in the garment whose pattern we want to develop. In our example, we are creating the pattern of a knee-length flared skirt, which has a placket in the center back. The waist has been finished with a facing. The first step is to trace the basic skirt block and note the adaptations required for creating the desired design. Here, the basic skirt block would need closing of waist darts and creating a flare at the hem. No change in the length is needed since the basic skirt block is also of knee length. An additional facing is required for finishing the waistline. The next step is to draw slash lines from the dart points to hemlines and parallel with center lines. Cut from hemline to the dart and not through the dart points on these slash lines. Now, close the darts. As you close the darts, a flare would appear at the hem. You may also increase the width of the hemline by extending by a few inches at the side seam also if required. Now blend across hemline and trace the pattern outline. According to our design, we will have to trace the facings of front and back skirt in the skirt and trace them separately. Now let us complete the pattern with information and markings. The instructions and symbols that are marked on a pattern generally fall into two categories. First is the written or the text information, and second are the markings and symbols. The text information starts with the identity of garment style, which is indicated by a style number or code of the pattern set. It may be structured in a customized way. For example, in our pattern, the style is identified as FS, which is short for flared skirt, and the design serial number as 01. This garment style number will be mentioned across all the pattern pieces of this design. Next in the list of text information is the identification of each pattern piece. In our pattern set, we have 4 pieces: flared skirt front, flared skirt back, front facing and back facing. Each piece is assigned a unique number, which in our case is 1, 2, 3, 4 respectively. Another important written information relates to the size of the garment. Size is indicated as size 10, 12, 24 or small, medium, large, etc. In our case, the size is mentioned as size 32 according to the waist size. Size information is also mentioned in each of the pattern pieces. Cutting information specifying the number of pieces to be cut for each of the pieces is also a very important text information mentioned on the pattern. It should be clearly mentioned as to how many pieces are to be cut. For example, cut 1, cut 2, cut 4. For example, generally, sleeves would require cutting 2 pieces per pattern if it is not an asymmetrical design. In our design, since there is a placket on the center of the back piece, the skirt back has to be cut in 2 separate pieces, while the front part would be cut as a single piece. Therefore, cut 1 is mentioned on the front and cut 2 is written in the skirt back. The same information is mentioned on the facings too. The date of the pattern is also mentioned in written text across all pattern pieces for easy referencing of the pattern. Another piece of written information is mentioned only in the case of fabrics having a unidirectional print or weave or a nabbed fabric like velvet, fur, etc. This instruction is written as cut one way on the pattern. This marking indicates that during layout or marker making, all the patterns have to follow the direction of the print or the nap, so that after sewing, the print or the nap remains unidirectional throughout. This information need not be mentioned if the fabric does not have unidirectional features. These are the most commonly used text information on a pattern. Now let us look at the markings presented on a pattern in the form of symbols. One of the most important symbols used on a pattern is grain line. Grain line indicates the direction of pattern placement on fabric. It may be in a lengthwise direction along the warp yarns in a woven fabric. It may be in a crosswise direction along the weft yarns, or it may be in a diagonal direction. Lengthwise grain line is marked as vertical lines with arrows on either side. Crosswise direction is marked as a horizontal line with arrows on either side. A diagonal line in a 45-degree angle indicates a bias grain line. While placing the pattern on the garment, the grain line is always kept parallel to the selvage. In our design of flared skirt, we have marked a lengthwise grain line on all the pattern pieces. However, a flared skirt, on account of its flare, may also be cut on a bias grain. Cut on fold can be indicated as a text, or it may be marked as a symbol. It appears as a straight line with arrows on either side pointing towards the pattern edge, which has to be placed along the fabric fold. In our design, since the front of the skirt is to be cut as a single piece by placing the center front along the fabric fold, a cut on fold instruction or symbol is marked along the center front line. Another very important marking is that of the seam allowance. It is marked outside of the pattern outline by adding the required margin for stitching the garment. In commercial patterns, the seam lines or stitching lines are usually marked as dashed lines. The amount of seam allowance varies depending upon the type of fabric and seam. The most common seam allowances are 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, or 5/8 of an inch. The seam allowance of two pattern pieces joined together along a common seam will have the same seam allowance. For example, back and front side seam will have the same seam allowance since they have to be attached together. Similarly, the armhole at the bodice and sleeve should also have the same seam allowance since they have to be attached together. One thing to remember is that no seam allowances is provided on the edges which are cut on fold. In our case, seam allowance is provided along the three edges of the front, while it is provided on all the four sides of the back pieces. Please also note that the pattern pieces and seam allowance presented in our example are not to scale and have been bit magnified to improve the visibility. Next marking that we will discuss are the notches. Notches are a special category of markings which serves many purposes. Notches are small marks made into the seam allowance of the pattern to ensure proper matching of pattern pieces during stitching. These appear as triangular cuts which may be cut inward or outward. The most common purpose of notches is to help in matching the pieces during garment construction, meaning the notches on two corresponding fabric pieces are matched together while forming a seam. Several notches are marked on the pattern using a pattern notcher and are transferred to the fabric also. These notches are particularly useful in correctly joining curved seams such as princess line, armhole, etc. Specialized notches are cut in groups for the purpose of relaxing the fabric tension along more curved areas of a seam. For example, collar, necklines, etc. Especially if any piece has to be turned inside out after stitching. These are applied much closer to the seam line. Notches are also used for transferring dart marks from the pattern onto the fabric at the seam allowance. Notches are also used to indicate the seam line along the fabric edge. Notch marks at each corner of the pattern edge guides the garment fabricators in the identification of seam allowance along each edge of the fabric pieces, particularly when these are not marked on the fabric. There are several placement markings used on the pattern. Some of the most common ones are zipper marking, which is indicated by a symbol of zipper teeth and is placed at the edge where the zipper has to be inserted. The width of tucks is marked by two parallel lines ending with the arrow in between indicating the width. Pleat symbol is marked by two vertical lines with an arrow between them indicating the width and the direction of the pleat fold. Button placements are represented by X marks, whereas the corresponding buttonholes are indicated by a horizontal or vertical slim rectangles or I-shaped marks. Pocket placements are indicated by the pocket shape with dots placed at each of the corners. In the case of our example of flared skirt, we are required to mark the location of a zipper at the center back starting from the waistline. This marking will also be indicated on the back facing. Adjustment lines are mostly found in commercial patterns, and these are marked as two parallel lines from where the length of the pattern can be safely increased or decreased. Squares, triangles and dots are used as additional marks where notches are not used. These can be used to match the seams or to indicate the location of specific construction features such as collars, facings, pockets, lining, clipping, gathering, stay stitching, etc. For example, dots indicate the starting and stopping points for stitching, as well as points for matching up the markings for darts. Bust point or apex point is indicated by a circle with an X marked in the center of the circle. Stitching line is usually represented by a dashed line, and it indicates where the two pieces are to be joined by sewing. Cutting line is normally shown as a solid line with the scissors to represent the cut. Cutting line is marked around the pattern and includes the seam allowance along the outer edges. Center front and center back are represented as straight lines formed by alternating dashes and dots. The center front runs vertically on the front of the pattern and the center back runs vertically on the back of the pattern. In today's session, we have made use of the example of the pattern set of a flared skirt and seen what information and symbols are marked on the pattern. By transferring these symbols from the pattern to the fabric will make sewing the different pieces together much easier later on. You can use the knowledge gained from this example for pattern marking every other type of pattern set. I hope you have found this session useful and will do the necessary practice to familiarize yourself with the requirements of pattern markings. Thank you.